Welcome, everybody. Very pleased to see you all here today in the Media Centre for Scientists Warning Europe's presentation. I'd like to start always by thanking some special groups that have helped us on our journey through to COP26. That's Sustainable Population Australia, Interfaith Centre for Sustainable Development, International Society for Ecological Economics, Facing Future Earth, and the Suu Kyi Foundation. I'm Ed Gemmell. I'm the Managing Director of Scientists Warning Europe, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by Tim Jackson, Ecological economist, Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey. Too many leaders are willing to risk future catastrophe when it will be another's problem. This is one of the lines that's in the World Scientists Warnings into Action paper that we brought out, or 15 scientists brought out, and we're helping them about 10 days ago. And that was stating the problem that we've got is to get the ambitious action we need to move the world forward into a safe place. Now, the World Scientists Warning into Action paper, it reviews the science at the top level, often referring to the IPCC reports, and it provides an uncompromising summary of the position we've got ourselves into and the actions we need to take. It's open for signature. It can be signed now at planetincrisis.com, so anybody can go to www.planetincrisis.com. All scientists who have graduated in a science, political science, social sciences, natural sciences, and engineers can sign the paper now. We're already at 2,000 signatures from scientists in over 100 countries, and we're hoping that we'll eventually reach 20,000 signatures and reach every country of the world. We also have a film coming out that we expect to bring out before the end of COP. It will be a short film created by Jonathan Clay, the director of the last David Attenborough and Johan Rockström film, which will be summarizing the headlines of the paper. The paper, like the previous three great scientists' warnings, goes through the 6 stresses. So it goes through nature, food, energy, economy, short-lived pollutants, and population. And today we're going to be focusing on the economics. It also, though, goes in and talks about leadership. Now, in the leadership, it talks about leadership both at a local level, at a community level, a city and town level, a national level, and even talking about the international level of leadership that we need in this darkest hour. Now, the paper says at one moment that protests and other bottom-up demands for change and experimentation will help break through the barriers and instill urgent action. And today, Fridays for Future have organised their march. I was there earlier on. We expect now that they've finished their march, Greta Thunberg and others will now be talking to them, and they're going to be demanding a lot more action. Nicola Sturgeon today even said that we are acting on the climate emergency, but even for her, she said, it's not enough and we must do more. Well, what does more look like? Well, one person who knows this is Tim Jackson, who's joined us today. And the one document that's saying this is the World Scientists Warning into Action paper. So, Tim, I think we'd probably like to start with your sort of take on the paper. What do you think of the recommendations in the economics section?
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for inviting me. It's a little bit like reading a history of my professional life for the last 30 years. As Ed said, Fridays for Future is meeting in George's Square at the moment, and Greta is famous for saying that for more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. It has been crystal clear for all of that time. I've worked alongside that science as an economist for all of that time, and it becomes very, very clear in a sense that the practical things that can be done are immediately doable, and all that's lacking is political will. And they are basic. In a world in which we have to get rid of carbon, subsidizing fossil fuels is a counterproductive move. I barely need saying. It is a counter-incentive. It's perverse. Those subsidies are perverse, and yet we're looking at $5 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies still, according to the IMF. That is a travesty. That's one of the things that the paper points out. Another of the elements that the paper points out is the restoration of natural capital and ecosystems, and as we'll come on to later, we are going to find ourselves in the position of having to restore nature. We need nature-positive economies by the middle of the century at the very latest, because we have not done enough to protect natural ecosystems. We haven't done enough to protect the climate. We'll need to be drawing carbon out of the atmosphere faster than we can ever pump it into the atmosphere within a couple of decades. And we will need to protect the biodiversity on which our food chain depends. This is a very basic call. We have another policy paper parallel to this, actually, which was put together by the Ecosystem Services group that reported recently on policies to protect biodiversity, and it has many overlaps with the warnings paper, the scientists' warnings into action paper. And I'll just pick one third thing, Ed, to talk about here, because it has been the focus of my professional life since I was Economics Commissioner on the UK Sustainable Development Commission, and it's the question of GDP growth. One of the things that stands in the way and has stood for 30 years in the way of doing what's needed to protect the science is what Greta has called fairy tales of eternal economic growth. An economic paradigm which is based on eternal growth, not just for the poorest in the planet, who undoubtedly do need higher incomes, but for the advanced economies as well, is pushing at planetary boundaries faster than we can cope with. I hope I can say a little bit more at the end, but I know that Ed, you'd like to come on to the question of how fast a reform do we need?
Yes, well, absolutely. And I know you've done a lot of work on this, actually. So let's go into a little bit of what needs to be done. You wrote a paper a couple of years ago. I understand you've done an update, which was called Zero Carbon Sooner. And in fact, you even addressed there a little bit of the net zero issue, so I'm probably prefacing one of the comments. So how soon do we need to act on this, and what have we got to focus on to get there?
Yeah, if anyone doesn't know the furious debate around the word net, now is the time to be educated in it. Net zero is a term that's used by the IPCC and by most politicians to account for the fact that we're unlikely to reduce our emissions far enough if we don't take political action, and we will need, as I said before, to then find technologies that pull them out of the atmosphere, so negative emission technologies. They're deeply contentious, their costs are uncertain, their effectiveness is unknown, and relying on them is a big mistake. So that tiny word net that sits in front of net zero by 2050 is one of the things that's wrong with the slogan net zero by 2050. The other is 2050. 2050 is not soon enough, and the climate science on this is just abundantly clear, and astonishes me that it has become so difficult to understand. In their latest IPCC Working Group 1 report, and the table to look at is the table 2 in the summary for policymakers, it sets out what is called a global remaining carbon budget. That's how much carbon we can afford to burn and put into the atmosphere between now and when we reach net zero. In other words, when there's a balance of carbon in the atmosphere. And that number is a very, very precise number. The estimate of the IPCC is that it is, at the end of this year, going forwards, we have around about 320 billion tons of CO2 that we could put into the atmosphere if we want to keep 1.5 alive. Everybody here in the blue zone is talking about keeping 1.5 alive. That has a very specific meaning in terms of carbon. It is that number, 320 billion tons of carbon. At the rate at which we're burning carbon at the moment, globally, that gives us about 8 years left before that carbon budget is blown and 1.5 becomes impossible. 1.5 alive means that we address seriously the idea of how much carbon we can afford to put in the atmosphere. At the global level, that gives us 8 years. Take a country like the UK, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, the birthplace of the fossil fuel era. Our historical responsibility and our per capita requirements for carbon would give us a budget of nothing more than about 2.5 billion tons of carbon per annum, and we are burning that at around about 500 million tons, so 500 million tons, on a consumption basis. For the UK, that means we run out of budget on current consumption levels in 5 years. So heading for 2050 is a travesty of the environmental and climate science which tells us what needs to be done. And the 2050 targets of politicians, it seems to me, are only there because they are outside the electoral cycle. They are not things that this government feels as though it urgently has to deal with, and that is a desperate mistake, because it is now that urgent action needs to be taken. And that's what the kids are saying on George Square. That is what the adults and their children are saying on George Square. That is what the pensioners are saying on George Square. And the energy of that place tells you something, not just about the passion of youth, but about the urgency of action. Zero Carbon Sooner will give you the details of those calculations and what it means in practice, but essentially the UK, a country like the UK, should be aiming for something as close as possible to zero carbon by the late 2020s or early 2030s, and that is climate science.
Yeah, it's shocking stuff, and we see a whole load of commitments. We've seen 30% now by 2030 for methane. Let's just go off-piste slightly, Tim, and think about some of the things you might have seen coming out of the COP at the moment. 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. Is that going to help us?
It will help us, but it won't reach what needs to be done. I mean, that is absolutely clear. The numbers that I look at in Zero Carbon Sooner and the numbers that the IPCC looks at in that sum of 320 billion tons is basically carbon dioxide. You've got to do the same kind of reduction with all of your other greenhouse gases, and that includes, of course, methane, nitrous oxides, hydrofluorocarbons, and so on and so forth. So you've got to basically follow that trajectory and aim for that sort of target for all the basket of 6 greenhouse gases.
Shouldn't we be aiming for 100% on methane by that point?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what it says, and the only way that you can get beyond 2030 is to do massive reductions very, very early. Otherwise, you just end up falling on a cliff. If you think, well, we'll just do a little bit and a little bit more next year, and we'll do a little bit more after that, and then in the last 5 years to 2050, we'll do the rest of it, that will not keep 1.5 alive. The climate science is very precise about that. What matters is not where you get to in 2050, it's how much carbon you've burnt along the way, how much methane you've put into the atmosphere along the way. As soon as the budget's blown, 1.5 is gone.
In the paper Zero Carbon Sooner, you also look at the trajectory, and I know you've said you've just updated it. So without scaring us too much, and I suspect you will, what is the sort of reductions we've got to see on a linear basis now between now and 2030?
Well, you're essentially, a linear pathway to 2030 will actually blow the budget. So a linear pathway to the kind of late 20s will just about get you to the budget. And if we think about our budget in consumption-based terms, that's the emissions that we're responsible for, not just on our territorial emissions, but also those in our trade and those that occur overseas. That's around about 500 million tons of carbon at the moment, and that has to be progressively reduced to zero in about 5 years. So we're looking at 100 million tons of carbon reduction per year over those 5 or 6 years if we follow that trajectory. If you think of a slightly different way of doing it, so you reduce by a percentage each year, we need something like a 20 to 25% reduction in carbon emissions each year, which is a bigger reduction than we saw in carbon emissions through COVID.
Yeah, and as we keep delaying, those keep going up.
As we keep delaying it, it gets worse and worse. I mean, actually, when I did the thing 2 years ago, the numbers were very slightly lower, and even though the IPCC very generously gave us a little more carbon budget than they did in the 5th assessment on the best available science, that budget was already blown because we had not made the progress that we needed to make in the 2 years since I first did it.
One other thing, actually, within the IPCC reports recently, they looked at a number of scenarios, and they suggested within those scenarios, the midpoint suggests that we're going to go past 1.5 degrees any time from 2027 to 2035. There doesn't seem to be a scenario now with a midpoint which actually suggests we're not going to go past 1.5 degrees.
From the IPCC scenarios, that's correct. I mean, the IPCC scenarios do err on the side of a conservative economic policy, I would say, in the sense that they broadly aim for scenarios that preserve the holy grail of economic growth in the way that we like and believe and hope as politicians that it will be delivered. There could certainly be scenarios, and we could think of them and create them and visualize them very easily, which didn't involve so much growth, perhaps even saw some reduction in economic activity, particularly in those carbon-intensive sectors, in which lifestyle change played a bigger part, in which there was more attempt to put pressure on the financial industry. I'm just speaking very briefly to that. 130 trillion assets, dollars of assets that Mark Carney has garnered together, promising to deliver by 2050, a net zero by 2050. Get those 130 trillion of assets to deliver by the mid-2030s at the latest. Then we are beginning to talk about a financial system that is really fit for purpose in a zero carbon world.
Right. We issued a letter recently. Scientists Warning Europe wrote a letter to Prime Minister Boris Johnson and to Prime Minister Mario Draghi as the co-hosts of COP26. And in that letter, we were asking for them to get to the target of 2030 net zero. Sorry for using the word net, I think we did in the letter, or as soon as possible thereafter. That Tim was one of the signatories of that, as were 27 other very famous experts and scientists from around the world, including James Hansen in the States, Kevin Anderson over here, Sir David King, and quite a number of others. In there, we were saying 2030. Let's just say that Italy and the UK do go for 2030. Is that going to be enough?
If they reach it, it's doing what it is our responsibility to do as a nation responsible for a certain percentage, and admittedly it's a very small percentage of global carbon emissions, but we clearly have to do more than that globally. And as an advanced economy, I think we hold a responsibility for the development of the poorest economies in the world, and those economies are the places where economic growth actually matters. So there will be some expansion of economic activity. That expansion of economic activity requires an energy system that's fit for purpose. That energy system fit for purpose requires investment. Investment requires finance. Finance means financial aid. So it means getting back to and going beyond the position that we should already have been at in relation to foreign aid, and making sure that climate finance flows to the poorest parts of the world.
And do you think it's flowing at the moment? How much do we need to up our game on the flows of finance?
At the moment, the game in town seems to be that our climate commitments will be taken out of the 0.7% of GDP, which is a paltry percentage of our GDP as an advanced nation, which should go to foreign aid. In other words, instead of reaching back to that target of 0.7% in foreign aid, we're actually substituting that target with something much too small in relation to climate science and climate finance. So at the moment, it is not happening, and it is, to me, an urgent priority, not just for climate reasons, but for reasons of social justice, that foreign aid is restored to the level that advanced economies agreed and have agreed over decades to contribute to poorer economies, and perhaps even to negotiate a higher target of GDP towards that end.
Right. Okay. The Committee on Climate Change here, in their last assessment that they brought out, had 4 scenarios for getting to net zero 2050. And within their fair wind scenario, they actually suggested it was going to be possible to get to net zero in 2042. And they did the assessment for that. And all 4 scenarios show that we'd be using GDP of only 0.5% up to 0.9% on our pathway there. Now, I'd be very interested if you would be able to comment on whether that is an emergency response to the problem, what our emergency response probably should look like in terms of GDP, and just to take 2042 for the moment, is that practical?
2042 seems more practical from a pragmatic point of view to a politician with long enough timescales. From a climate science position, it's clearly not, from what we've talked about.
Yep.
I mean, the question of the impact of those things and the speed with which we need to do it, if you take the climate science seriously, if you act as though it were true, in the words of the Fridays for the Future and Extinction Rebellion, that means some quite dramatic changes, not just in the low-hanging fruit of existing technologies to decarbonize our electricity system, but also in much harder to reach sectors. So domestic heating, industrial heating, iron, steel, aviation, shipping, all of the sectors actually which have underpinned our materially based and energy intensive consumption lifestyles and indeed our production, our industrial production. So I guess the point is that when you take it seriously, you have to rethink what your economy is doing. Is the economy about making as much stuff as fast as possible and throwing it away to maximize profits for shareholders? Or is the economy about creating well-being for the citizens of the nation? When you take that focus away from production and you put it on well-being, you move your economic activity into sectors like care, health, social care, education, renovation, refurbishment, the places that make the quality of our lives rich, which employ more people, and which are low carbon sectors of the economy. And the reason that has not happened is that economists are committed to the idea of productivity growth, which happens mostly in those materially based sectors where you can replace people with machines and materials and reduce the content of labor. That is in the wrong direction. It's creating unemployment, it's making more materially intensive economies, it's creating more energy intensive economies, and it's not addressing the gaps in care, in social care, in our health, in the building of hospitals that could create a quality of life which is much, much better for all of the citizens of the nation. And that's the direction of travel that I see as being missing from the dialogues about the transition to net zero. Net zero transition is not just capital markets putting lots of money into new kit. It is about the transition to a decent economy that regards well-being for everyone as its goal and supports those sectors that deliver that well-being, in particular supporting the care workers who've proved their worth through the pandemic and yet are still amongst the most precarious livelihoods, the least secure salaries, and the lowest status on our planet. And that is a travesty itself. It sits, for me, right at the heart of economics, and in particular at the heart of the growth-based economic paradigm, and addressing that challenge, addressing that transition within economics, within our economic systems, is the same as addressing the challenge of net zero. That economy, the green economy, is an economy of care and connection and relationship and service to one another. And it is also a vision for human participation that goes beyond the simplistic vision at the heart of industrial capitalism, which sees us all as producers on the one hand and as consumers on the other. In reinventing that economic paradigm, we allow ourselves the freedom to become human.
I think just before coming back, actually, probably to national and international leadership, which is what COP26 is mainly about, but spending 1 minute on something which dovetails into what you've just been talking about. The World Scientists Warning into Action paper does also suggest we get back to localization, which seems to dovetail into what you've just said. And what would local leaders, community leaders, or council leaders at that sort of level, what should they be focusing on to try and encourage that?
When I was Economics Commissioner on the Sustainable Development Commission, we used to tour the country, going around region after region in the UK, and we would hear the same narrative about how the region was going to prosper. And it was going to prosper by encouraging inward investment in high technology, high productivity sectors that would compete in the technology markets in order to create products that would bring wealth in that would then trickle down to the poorest in those regions. This was in the years leading up to the financial crisis, and yet I heard that in every single constituency that we went to as commissioners. I heard it in the devolved regions, I heard it in the English regions, I heard it in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. That was the strategy, and it was the strategy, broadly speaking, of a kind of neoliberal capitalism across the world that failed spectacularly in the financial crisis and delivered the precarity in wages and livelihoods and the professions that matter that left us ill-prepared for a pandemic. That is the wrong strategy. The strategy has to be about building community from the bottom up. It has to be about a localization, particularly in relation to care and social care. It has to be about the renovation of communities. It has to be about the refurbishment of buildings. It has to be about jobs in every constituency to create a building stock that is not leaking carbon into the atmosphere. All of this, and you're right, and the paper is right, is essentially a new localism. It's a localism agenda that doesn't eschew the global world. It doesn't turn its back on poverty in other places. It doesn't suggest that we're going back into caves. What it does is to deepen and enrich relationship and community at the local level. And I think this call is right.
Great. Just the last couple of minutes, they're moving back up to the higher level. And we know that a lot of the political leaders and a lot of the business leaders are interested in the money and the upside on everything. Is there potentially an economic upside in the UK or Italy getting to 2030? I mean, and dare we say it, could there even be an increase in GDP by getting to 2030 net zero?
It is actually possible in the sense that there is a massive amount of investment that needs to be doing. Investment is a contribution to the GDP, and that investment could be an economic uplift. And now I would argue, and you wouldn't expect me not to say that that's the wrong indicator to be chasing on its own. You know, I think if it leads to a GDP increase, so be it, as long as the impact on the planet is reduced during that process. So if there were a short-term increase in the GDP as a result of the investments that have to be taken place in the short term, then that is entirely possible. In a way, though, the biggest upside from doing what we need to do now is the avoidance of a massive downside. And the finance on that is very, very clear. The Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK did some calculations recently about the impact on the debt to GDP ratio from taking early action on climate change. And they suggested that it might add 20 percentage points to the debt to GDP ratio. Now, right now, there's a discussion about whether our debt to GDP ratio is already too high. It's around about 107% of the GDP. And therefore, we should engage in some new form of austerity to bring that down. That's the argument that's going on at the moment. That is a huge mistake. And the Office for Budget Responsibility makes that clear. A 20% percentage points uptake would take us to something like 120% debt to GDP ratio. That is still low by historical standards. It's still low by European standards. It's still low by the standards of Japan. And there is no indication that it's harmful to the economy. But failing to do that, as the Office for Budget Responsibility makes clear, would leave us with a debt to GDP ratio of 300% by the end of the century because of the damages that unmitigated climate change will be forcing on our economy. The biggest upside to early action is the avoidance of that massive downside.
Great. I worry, though, that we're already at the point where early action actually isn't really possible. But anyway, timely action, or as soon as we can.
Early action is always possible. I mean, you know, when is the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When is the second best time to plant a tree? Today. And that is a message that we should never forget. It's never too late to take early action.
Great. Then last question for about a 20-second reply on this. If Boris Johnson was brave enough to take a 2030 target, or any of the other leaders, what would his first action be afterwards?
Eliminate those fossil fuel subsidies, send a clear signal to the world that has to happen. Set in place a carbon army to renovate our failing building stock, to reduce energy consumption, put in place policies across the 4 nations of the UK that are consistent in relation to things like electric vehicles. You can get a 0% loan in Scotland that you can't get in London for electric vehicles. Putting in place incentives to create a world in which the citizens who are now with Greta in George Square demanding change, in which those citizens with good intentions can live decent lives without destroying the planet. And those things are all within the realms of the possible. They're all in this paper. Many of the actions are in this paper. Some of them are also in the report that I wrote for the Sustainable Development Commission, Prosperity Without Growth. And they have been talked about by world-leading economists, by Nobel Prize winners, by physicists, by chemists, by luminaries in the artistic professions, by sages throughout the ages, and they are entirely doable for a Prime Minister with the courage and the wit and the will to do it.
Great, thanks very much, Tim. And now, just in our literally closing seconds, we've got to imagine at the moment that we are running a marathon. We've got to break a world record. This has never been done before, and that's what we need to see at COP26. The leading pack are doing a lot of good running. They're doing some good things, but we need somebody, but they're off the pace. So currently they're not on world record pace, and we need somebody to break from the front of the pack and really go for it and try and get the world record. And if we don't do that, we're going to fail to get it. So what we're looking for at COP26 is real leadership. It's talked about in the paper. Tim has talked about it now. And now we need Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Prime Minister Mario Draghi and the others to break from the pack, give us a 2030 target or something as close as possible to that, and save all of humanity. Thank you very much for joining us all today. Thank you very much, Tim.